The scripture lesson this evening is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verses 20b through 39, and this is from the New Revised Standard Version. Listen now for these words from the Gospel of Mark. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And then they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription, the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's Son."
From this passion story, today we will concentrate only on that one statement, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." That is Greek transliteration of Hebrew, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me? According to Mark and Matthew, 2 Gospels in the Bible, this is the cry of dying Jesus. And on this Good Friday, I want to offer you 4 theological vignettes. And first one is, I call it the Cry of Radical Abandonment. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is a transliterated quotation from Psalm 22. and it highlights radical loneliness and abandonment, but perhaps in the way not many people assume. This cry, this psalmic quotation confirms that we do not actually know how Jesus died. Maybe that Simon, who was carrying the cross and then was known through his sons, that might be the only source. But no one from his disciples was there. Certainly not them. All had abandoned him. And the early church, with reverent sorrow, used this Psalm 22 ex post to reconstruct, to tell and preach the story of Jesus' death. The torture by soldiers, the mocking of onlookers, the dividing of his clothes, even the casting of lots, all are elements taken from Psalm 22, woven into the Passion story with theological care and personal grief. So the first message today is encoded in this quotation, is the existential loneliness of Jesus. We don't know how he died. Even his passion narrative was a pious, compassionate reconstruction, hermeneutic reconstruction of Psalm 22 by those who had failed him. And their regretful disciples' testimony it is. Now the second vignette, I call that Rejecting Substitutionary Atonement. So secondly, this Eloi Eloi lama sabachthani is often interpreted not as an abandonment by disciples, as we talked about it just moments ago, but abandonment by God. And here I must categorically reject this doctrine of substitutionary atonement, that perverted medieval theology which claims that Jesus was forsaken by God and had to suffer that way and to die, to atone, to make arrangements with God for humanity, as a substitution to appease an angry deity. Only Jesus' death, this doctrine says, could placate God. And John Dominic Crossan, American theologian, New Testament scholar, rightly calls this doctrine a crime against divinity, because it turns our loving God into a cruel, bloodthirsty tyrant who demands death to be satisfied. It is a dark, dark theology, friends, driven by cruelty, magical thinking, and medieval superstition, and sadly still thrives among many Christians, and especially American fundamentalists. Just 2 weeks ago, I received an email promoting so-called Christian book. And it reads like this, the title of that book: Unlock the Supernatural Powers of Jesus' Blood. You know, I grew in an enlightened family. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister. My father is a psychiatrist. And I studied theology, religion, and anthropology. And from this vantage point, this notion of unlocking supernatural blood power, or power of blood, is wrong on so many levels. It borders on blasphemy, witchcraft, black magic, and psychologically, sadism, psychopathy, and even necrophilia. That is a pathological fascination with death. And friends, this is not just a theological oddity. Unfortunately, bad theology has real-world consequences. Many are shocked now by our cruel government's action, by its cruelty, both domestically and internationally. I follow international news. And they are asking, where it is coming from, this cruelty in the action of this government. But I believe part of the root lies right here, in bad theology, in bad faith. People who worship a cruel and vindictive God are spiritually predisposed to be cruel or to excuse cruelty. Beware such religion. It is not of God. My third vignette I called Docetism and the Illusion of Escape. So thirdly, Eloi Eloi lama sabachthani has been used by some early unorthodox Christians, Gnostics are often called, to escape the brutal reality of the cross and of the world. They were called, more specifically, it was a stream within Gnosticism, they were called Docetists, from the Greek word or verb dokein, meaning to seem, or to appear. In their view, God could not suffer, and if Christ was divine, then he could not truly suffer either. And so some believed Christ was entirely a spiritual being who merely appeared, here is that dokein, only seemed to be human. Others thought that divine Christ descended like a dove upon human Jesus at the time of baptism, that's in the Bible. And later, after completing that enlightening education of human race, departed before the crucifixion or during the crucifixion, before the death, leaving only the human husk of Jesus to die. For them, "Why have you forsaken me?" was exactly a moment of departure of this divine Christ from human Jesus. Now you understand why our creeds, church creeds, insist that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. Not two beings, but one person. This doctrine is called the hypostatic union in theology. Friends, Docetism may be less dangerous than the cruel God of substitutionary atonement, but it is still toxic. Because when you think about it, it is selfish, escapist, spiritually escapist, and frankly, delusional. We cannot avoid suffering by pretending it isn't real. We cannot avoid that for ourselves, and we cannot certainly avoid that even for Christ. And finally, my fourth vignette, I call that Costly Grace and the God who suffers with us. Eloi Eloi lama sabachthani is, for me, the source of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called costly grace. Not a cheap one, the one really suffered through. I was shaped by pastors and professors who had survived the Nazi occupation in Central Europe. Many experienced labor camps, prisons, torture, even concentration camps. And when then, after the war, there was a short period of freedom and quick turn again back to communism, and it only improved slightly. So, living through that, at least through my teachers and pastors who fought me, and partly under communism, under the oppression, we understood the world from below, from the position of those who are oppressed and downtrodden, those humiliated. And some of the best among that generation who went through the war times lost their lives, and others barely survived. And they taught us, and even wrote books on the foolishness of the cross. But that foolishness is celebrated, just like it is in Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians, when he writes, now in my paraphrases, some seek miracles for miracles' sakes or to make their lives easier, perhaps. Others seek wisdom for the wisdom's sake and maybe gain power through that. But we preach Christ crucified, writes Paul. A stumbling block to miracle seekers, foolishness to wisdom seekers. But God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. If you ask me how to translate that in today's America, perhaps the best way to explain this is to take seriously the theology of the late black liberation theologian James Cone, here in New York City at Union Seminary, whose final book bore the title The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Because on the cross, as a lynching tree, God becomes crucified. But God becomes the oppressed. That is true compassion, to suffer with those who are suffering. No matter what self-important billionaires might claim, when they derided compassion as something not to aspire for, and being even the reason for deterioration of our society. No, compassion is the highest divine power and organizing principle of the entire universe. That is the message of Good Friday. If we suffer, we know God is suffering with us. And if we are not suffering ourselves, we are called to stand with, support, and advocate even fight for those who do suffer. Just like those who were abducted from our streets and dumped into concentration camps without due process, and now being even spitted upon through mass media, blackened, tarred, and feathered unjustly, while due process is left behind and they are being left to rot in those concentration camps. I'm so proud that we can and we do speak on their behalf and are advocating for them. Because there is no greater glory, no greater blessing than sharing in God's compassion and finding ourselves on the side of God.